Welcome everyone to our class on the philosophy of technology at SUNY Buffalo. My name is Nicholas Simone, and my responsibility was the Week 2 presentation from the Kaplan readings in the philosophy of technology, and I have chapters 7, 8, 10, and 11. So I did just put a few examples of technology throughout the centuries. I do recall at the turn of the century in 2000, A&E was doing a top 100 inventions of all time, and in my class the students were having a big debate on what was going to be number one, and it turned out that they decided it was the printing press, for what it's worth. So I thought I would begin with a definition quickly of globalization, because as I was doing all the readings, pretty much when I do anything I'm reading academically, I have Thomas Friedman in the back of my mind, and his book, The World is Flat, which was first published in 2005, really became like the seminal work on the issue of globalization. And then more recently, as Thomas Friedman has been discussing some of the changes in the worldwide economy, this is a quote from him. He said, "When I sat down to write The World is Flat, Facebook didn't exist, Twitter was still a sound, the cloud was still in the sky, 4G was a parking space, LinkedIn was a prison, applications were what you sent to college, and Skype was a typo." And I think those words just show us how quickly and rapidly technology is expanding, right before our eyes. So first I have here Chapter 7, the Philosophy of Technology Meets Social Constructivism, a Shopper's Guide. That was by Philip Bray. He provides us with a definition of social constructivism, which the more I did the reading, the more I realized how critical this was to understanding what these philosophers were saying. And he poses, and basically it's the theory that attempts to identify how knowledge is developed, pretty much through human interaction with others. So Bray poses the following questions. Could the philosophy of technology benefit from social constructivist approaches in technology? And then how would the philosophy of technology be transformed as a result? And I just put on the side, just as an example, just how quickly online courses are increasing in numbers throughout the country and obviously throughout the world. He appears to be considering the usefulness of empirical studies for evaluating technology. So how important it is for everything to be data-driven. I think as educators, we have been living through that over the years, as there's been more and more of an emphasis on using data to evaluate our performances in school. Some of the questions that Bray poses in the second section of his work: is the philosophy of technology too abstract? Does more empirical data need to be used? And what is the impact of technological change and innovation on society? And he argues that technological change does not take a linear path in how it impacts society, but instead it is influenced by social choices. He also makes a point of emphasizing that technology is not neutral. Choices must be made. In the third section, he points out that these studies regarding technology pretty much originated in the mid-1980s, and they looked at the impact that social factors played on the choices that were made. And he noted the commercial success of technology should not play a factor in evaluating its impact on society. So here, of course, as an Android user, I know that the commercial success of Apple might be viewed as it being a better form of technology, but then those of us that are Android users know that that is simply not the case. Also in section 3, there was a quote that I took: "The stabilization of technology implies that there is no controversy," and I couldn't help but think about our recent election, Hillary Clinton's decision to have her email server in her house. I think that was pretty controversial, as was were the allegations of the Russian hacking into the campaign files of the DNC and the RNC. Bray then goes on to highlight 3 different approaches to use social constructivism. First is the strong social constructivism. This is the impact. This is saying that the impact of society is paramount to understanding technological change. Then there is the mild social constructivism thought, which is a more moderate view on how social factors impact technology, but it doesn't dismiss that non-social factors play a role as well. And then there's the actor network theory, which focuses on the impact of humans and the environment. In his fourth section, he starts to focus on Langdon Winner, who is someone who has been critical of using social constructivist theory to evaluate technology. And some of the points that Winner makes is that by emphasizing innovation, the theory is disregarding the impact of people's choices. He also says that it focuses too much on those who create the technology and not enough on the people who are impacted directly by the technology. Winner also says that it does not take enough account for the cultural choices that people make, and that there is no discussion on evaluating the moral and political choices. So Winner really believes that the scope of the studies are too limited and they do not take into enough of account political and social factors. And again, as a social studies teacher, I think that's quite relevant and significant for my daily life in how I use technology. I also think we have to take into account the economic factors. But the proponents of social constructivist theory believe that one must look at the results on both a macro and micro level. And while progress has been made, Bray points out there is still tension between these two camps and different points of view. In section 5, Bray starts to focus more on the mild social constructivist view, which again is more focused on innovation than on effects. And there's more of a use of normative statements, which is basically making value judgments, and that allows for more of a personal bias regarding the politics of technology. Then Bray references Andrew Feenberg and the Frankfurt School, and then I didn't realize that Andrew Feenberg was going to be one of the authors of a later chapter, so I struggled a little bit to get through this section, and then when I read Andrew Feenberg, it all came together. It also helped that I had a student in my class that had similar views last year. But anyway, the Frankfurt School is the school of social theory that is both critical of capitalism and critical of Soviet-style socialism. When that student was challenged in class by his peers who wanted to know if he was liberal or conservative, he tried to explain to them that he was an anarchic syndicalist. And I'll save that for another time. All right, so in this section, Bray concludes that modern technology will lead to domination by one group over another, while social constructivism will hopefully lead to more democratization. And then he goes into the third part, the actor network theory, in which technology, just like humans, can have intended and unintended consequences. In the sixth section, Bray focuses on his belief that considers social choices having a far more of a direct impact on technology and its use. He believes that strong social constructivism makes the job of an analyst more challenging. And then Bray uses the metaphor to describe how technology is a text and it can be read differently by various actors. He then focuses on a little bit of a disagreement between Winner and Pfaffenberger, who disagree on the level by which politics impacts technology. I started to think about the jokes regarding Al Gore and whether or not he created the internet. But in reality, then I thought about Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, who went through the entire litany of ways that the government does help people to promote technological development. This was also, this concept of what level politics impacts technology was controversial in the 2012 election when President Barack Obama was quoted as saying, "You didn't build that," and a lot of people in the Republican Party used that as a rallying point. But then Elizabeth Warren said, and I quote, "There's nobody in this country who got rich on their own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you, but I want to be clear. You moved your goods to market on roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory. Now look, you built a factory and it turned into something terrific or a great idea. God bless. Keep a hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is that you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes along." And I do think that there is a strong connection between the impact that politics can have on the development of technology. So the conclusion that Bray comes to is that more studies need to be conducted using both normative, which are value-based, and empirical data. But the choices made in technological innovation clearly have an impact on how society views technology and what society learns from it. Chapter 8 now is a reading and a focus on gender roles regarding technology, really posing the question is, would a feminist evaluation of technology differ from others? And again, with our recent presidential election, there is no question that this is something that we should all be able to ponder, the impact that gender had on the results. I put a little chart there with the money that was donated from the technology sector to 2016 presidential candidates. Thought it was a little bit ironic that Bernie Sanders got the most money from that industry. The beginning of this section, I'm not sure why Bush went with this as a starting point, but she focuses on a quote from an erotic novel, the story of O, and then focuses on Brown, Miller, and Griffin, considering rape to be a crime of violence, not a crime of passion. That, I think, society has come to be in pretty constant agreement about. And then she begins with a quote that says, "The tech fix is the belief that technology can be used to solve all types of problems, even social ones." I did ponder for a second if studies like this, focusing on gender roles, may change in the years to come as we become far more sympathetic understanding of in the transgender community. So then she focused a little bit on how technology can help solve world poverty, and there were two stories that came to mind for me, both from 60 Minutes. The first one was a program called M-Pesa, where people in Africa can use a texting app to send money to each other. And I thought it was just a great example of how technology can be used to uplift people. And then the second one was this laptop program called One Laptop Per Child, which was it was a nonprofit that formed in 2005. It was trying to provide $100 or less laptops to children all throughout Africa. And I think this is a great example of how technology can help to solve world poverty. The author then goes on to make the claim that social welfare programs are gender discriminatory. And she makes a point of making sure that we do not use the words tool, technology, and technique interchangeably. Tools are the machines or the instruments, whereas technology is techniques is the skills or procedures that people use the tools for, and then technology is combining the tools and techniques to form the overall industry. And I thought this was a great warning that she made. If you believe that technology is the answer to solve all problems, then people are not motivated to act. But if you fear the forces of technology, then people also do nothing. And in the context of my work, when I see teachers who are so reluctant to utilize technology, I think they definitely need to take the fear factor away from them. Her next section was all about the context of women in technology, and she emphasizes that there is the design or the development of technology, the user, the environment, and the cultural aspect. Bush believes that the historical inequality faced by women must be taken into account regarding the evolution of technology, and this process provides us with an opportunity to ponder how women have been impacted by technological innovation from era to era. And I thought she used a very good example of the washing machine, about how the changes in technology do have an impact in shaping the lives of women. Since I had just finished my unit teaching women's history, this was very relevant for me. I figured I had to put somebody up there, so I went with Charlotte Woodward, the only female who was at the Seneca Falls Convention, the beginning of the women's rights movement, who actually lived to see the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. This was one of the stronger sections of Bush's article, the environmental concerns at technology and what impact does this have on gender roles between men and women. And she uses a great example of women on the Great Plains. Initially, because women had control of food and travel, they had a more of a power structure in society. But then as technology progressed and horses were introduced, this changed. I think that was a very relevant point. And then there's also a section about Rachel Carson, considered one of the leading environmentalists, and her book Silent Spring. Bush concludes by asking the question, do advances in technology benefit everyone? She is definitely trying to define technology, and she explains how most definitions use man or men, implying all, but possibly excluding women. And then here's the best definition that she provides, or the one that she believes is best to define technology. Technology is a form of human cultural activity that applies the principles of science and mechanics to the solution of problems. It includes the resources, tools, processes, personnel, and systems developed to perform tasks and create immediate, particular, and personal and/or competitive advantages in a given ecological, economic, and social context. That is a far better definition than I provided in the introduction to this course. I wish I would have had that earlier. She then goes into great depth on the four contexts of technology by using the refrigerator as an example. And this made me ponder a lot, because she talks about how the changes in the refrigeration changed the roles for women. And of course, I'm thinking today that what we've now done in many households is we've added a second refrigerator to the house. And what does that say about us and the changes that we've made? And her conclusion is that analysis must include both advantages and disadvantages and focus primarily on equity. The third chapter from my section, chapter 10 by Andrew Feenberg, was all about democratic rationalization. And again, as a social studies teacher, I probably enjoyed this one the most. There's an early reference to Karl Marx and his predictions during the mid-19th century. I had to lament the fact that Friedrich Engels yet again gets disregarded, not really sure why, as the other author of the Communist Manifesto. But Feenberg really talks about how citizens will continue to struggle unless they are part of the decision-making process. And the essence of Marxist socialism is that the workers must control the means of production. So without this condition, democracy cannot be successful. And then he questions, well, have we really responded to Marx's requests? And are there areas where this has been successful? The early parts of this chapter were a little wonky, but I believe that what Feenberg was trying to point out is, can society allow for rationalization theory and democratization? And I think when I finished this chapter, I really believe that he is a Marxist socialist who just wishes that there was a successful example to utilize rather than just bashing the whole theory. He cites Marshall McLuhan as saying that technology has reduced us to the sex organs of machines. Not really sure exactly what's meant by that, but I thought I should put it in there. And then he compares the difference between determinism, which is the impact technology can be evaluated without studying its effect on society, and technological determinism, which states that society can be influenced by technology without technology being influenced by society. And the thesis of unilinear progress, technology progresses from lower to higher levels of productivity, but it also experiences obviously different stages of development. And then the thesis of determination by the base, where social institutions must adapt to the impact of technology around them. Feenberg points to two sociologists, Pinch and Bitschker, who used the bicycle and its evolution as an example of how safety won out over pleasure in its development. And I did find that very interesting. However, then I thought about bicycles today. And on the left, you see Denmark, a country that has embraced bicycles as a form of transportation, and they've done extremely well with it. But then, as somebody who resides in Manhattan, I have seen the bicycles that is to the right, and they have not exactly been as successful as people maybe have hoped. And I don't know if that's because of the development of the city or the behavior of the people. Feenberg gets very historical in the next section. First, in defining determinism. In philosophy, this basically means that every action or series of actions were caused by previous ones. And then he focuses on, the reform of factories in Britain in the 1800s. And when this factory bill of 1844 was passed, it established a 12-hour workday, even though children between 9 and 13 could only work 9 hours. Of course, that begs the question, how would you actually know what their real age was? Women and children were no longer allowed to clean dangerous machinery. You can make a connection back to the last chapter and find if you think that's discriminatory or not. And that accidental deaths must be reported and investigated. Now, one of the leaders, Lord Ashley, supported this regulation, but there were leading businessmen who said that it's only going to lead to lower wages and production problems. And I couldn't help but think about the same debate that people are having today over the minimum wage. So many businessmen argue that if they have to increase the minimum wage, that it will lead to them having to lay off workers. And I think Feinberg's conclusion is why? Why does one have to lead to the other? I think he makes that point pretty well. I also love the highlight of my section of reading this week was his reference to the Luddites. I use this all the time in class when I have kids who are so reluctant to embrace technology. And these were the people in the 1800s who were destroying the machines, fearful that they were going to take over their jobs. And I think we just have to recognize today that people will need to reinvent themselves. I use as an example the concern about the coal miners. I understand that coal miners might not want to be replaced, but it's not a healthy job for them, and maybe we need to do a better job educating them for a different sector of the workforce. Overall, the work in the 1800s to reform factories proved that regulation contributed to a more educated and skilled workforce, and Feinberg concludes this by stating that technology is a theme of social struggle. And I just thought that was an excellent opportunity to really ponder where we are today with technology. And then he points out that you must appreciate the connection that technology has with society, and the examples he used: nuclear power and surrogate motherhood. These are extraordinary changes that have a wide-ranging impact on so many people's lives. I was completely unaware of this French company that he refers to. First, he said it was Teletel. I couldn't even find that, but then I realized that it changed its name to Minitel. And this was one of the early, sorry, that's the bell. Sorry, that's the early morning bell here. Minitel was a French company that allowed people to search databases prior to the World Wide Web. I knew nothing of this. And early on, some people used it to find companionship or for amusement or even for sex, which of course wasn't the initial purpose of the company. And I had to think a little bit of Snapchat here, because when Snapchat first came out, a lot of people viewed it as a sexting app. And who would think years later, to the left, that's Peter Hanby. He's the head of the news division at Snapchat. He used to work at CNN. So think about how somebody would actually go from CNN to a quote-unquote sexting app, and that shows how much technology can evolve based on the desires of the consumers. Feinberg then begins to discuss the role of the worker and his level of productivity in a system. Does rationalization help to answer these questions? This is really where he gets into the debate between capitalism and socialism. And you can tell that he's just completely focused on how technology should be used to democratize the society. And then he discusses environmental concerns that might exist because of technology. And can capitalists and environmentalists coexist? I probably could spend a lot more time talking about this, but the Dakota Pipeline is a fine example of that. The other one would be the debate over fracking for natural gas. Can we find a middle ground? Can we still provide for capitalism and protect the environment? I would say yes, and I think Feinberg would say yes as well. And to conclude Feinberg's chapter, he uses the steamboats and boiler explosions during the 1800s for his analysis. And I will say this is something I have never taught. The extent of my steamboat lessons have really been Robert Fulton, Claremont, and let's move on. And I definitely am going to utilize this in my lessons next year. There were just so many accidents and explosions, but owners and boilermakers were resistant to government interference. And it took 5,000 people dead before laws were enacted. So I think that's a very, very good point about the technical code. At the end, Feinberg is a little bit critical of Heidegger's view on technology, specifically its relationship to society. And I think his main point is that Heidegger can't distinguish. There's no middle ground for him, that either technology is beneficial for everybody or it's destructive for everybody. And the examples, electricity, I think we would all agree is good, but the atomic bomb is bad. Agriculture is good, but obviously death camps during the Holocaust are one of the worst atrocities ever committed. So Feinberg concludes by reiterating his belief and refuting the notion that technology is determined by necessity and efficiency. A society can be technological and democratic. Technology must look out for the greater good of society. Is this socialistic, he asks, and he answers yes. And then, as I think I said earlier, he hopes we can redefine what this means and don't be discouraged by all the failed communist states that most people think about. And the last chapter that I had to cover was by Bruno Latour, titled The Collective of Humans and Non-Humans, following Daedalus's Labyrinth. The first thing I thought about, of course, was IBM's Watson, which started as a Jeopardy game and has continued at a tremendously rapid pace. There was a early definition of epistemology, which is distinguishing justified beliefs from opinions. Basically the theory of knowledge. Sorry, I couldn't help myself here with the alternative facts reference. But he starts with this myth of Daedalus. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. And my Greek mythology is not an area of expertise. But the moral of that story is to make sure that one thinks of the long-term implications and ramifications of one's inventions. You should be taking into account both the good and the bad. And there's obviously a tremendous amount of morality at play there. Latour then uses the slogans for the NRA and, of course, challenges to the NRA for the arguments for and against guns. I thought this was a very easy explanation of how much of a disparity there is in the analysis of technology. So we all know people will say guns don't kill people, people kill people. But then he really expands on this to point out that there are so many variables between the gun and there's so many variables between the gunmen. So it's just not as simple as we might think. And then Latour, his chapter, it basically broken up into the four meanings of technical mediation: interference, composition, the folding of time and space, and crossing the boundary between signs and things. And then he uses the overhead projector and speed bumps to illustrate his points, and I couldn't help but laugh with the overhead projector. I could picture all the people trying to fix the overhead projector. Of course, today that would simply be the PowerPoint slides that teachers would be relying on. And the speed bump argument was very interesting. Are you more interested in protecting the safety of pedestrians, or are the speed bumps a way to protect yourself? And I think that selfish interests definitely play a factor in that discussion. So that concludes my presentation, and I wish everybody the best of luck in this course and the program, and I will see you at one of our virtual sessions. Take care.